Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Today we start a new series with an in-depth study of the book of Acts of the New Testament. We will have several introductory lessons prior to directly addressing chapter and verse in order to establish a better foundation for interpreting and understanding the text. As we have, as is the general approach we use here, we will use a number of scholarly writings to guide especially my lectures. The lead scholar used for this whole series will be Dr. Carl R. Holliday. His 2016 commentary on Acts is outstanding. It's got high reviews all over the world, really. He has very recently retired from Chandler School of Theology at Emory University, and he has gained a very strong academic and theological resume over his lifetime. His doctorate is from Cambridge, England, Cambridge University, England. In addition to a strong theological background, he is an expert in Hellenistic Judaism and the history of the church and its development, especially during the first century. He is a native of East Tennessee, so he's kind of one of us. Scholars note Acts content as a whole is not a well-known book by Christians, as the lectionary cycle uses very little of the total content. A few stories from it are used in Easter season, with the main one being used is the Pentecost story. Thus, a big part of our objective will be to read and study it all in detail and in context, rather than selecting random scriptures out of context of the whole. Scholars have long considered Acts to be volume 2 of Luke's narrative. Combined, the two volumes tell the early Christian story. Is one good summary statement that I read. Luke's gospel takes that story from the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus through Jesus' ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension. Acts picks up the story with Christ's ascension and the Holy Spirit's arrival, and takes them through the establishment of the Christian faith and church in Jerusalem and in Judaism, where it starts, through its expansion into the Gentile Roman world of that first century. Therefore, Acts is the connecting link between the gospel stories of Jesus and the letters that we have studied for the last several years. Dr. Eugene Boring taught that Acts is the only book in the Bible to portray the beginning of the Christian church and faith and its expansion. Hence, Christians should study it more. Luke has long been considered to be the author of Acts, even though the author is anonymous in the oldest manuscripts. There is evidence referring to Luke's Acts as early as about 180 AD. The bishop of Caesarea in 325 AD established the author of the writing as Luke, the physician, native of Antioch of Syria, and the traveling companion of Paul, teaches Dr. Holliday. He does this in establishing for the church that Luke was not an apostle, but was associated with those who had witnessed the apostles' work and was an eyewitness to Paul's work. That bishop notes in his letter to the church that when Paul refers to according to my gospel, he means Luke's gospel, Other writers note that when Luke uses we or us, he is implying he was a witness to that event. But most of what Luke writes in this 2-volume series is mainly based on what he heard from eyewitnesses to the apostles' teachings, is what most scholars conclude. Luke may not have been actually fully accepted. Luke himself may not have fully accepted Paul as an official apostle, although he considered him to be in the role of an apostle. Luke was not a member of Jesus' disciples based on evidence to date, scholars note. However, the assumption is here that he became a close associate of some of the apostles themselves in Antioch. Of course, all of them were there at one time, and maybe elsewhere. His name is Greek, so most assume he is Gentile, but others debate that also. Some do not accept Luke as the author of Acts, if this be the same Luke who was with Paul as he ministered as an apostle to the Gentile people. Their argument is that at no time does the author mention Paul's letters in Acts. Furthermore, they argue that collection for the impoverished Christians of Judea that we learned about throughout Paul's letters is not mentioned in Acts. Yet it was an extremely important part of some of Paul's letters, as we noted. Also, the Jerusalem Accord in Acts that allowed Gentile entry into the church is not in Paul's letters. Paul's strong theology on justification by faith and the saving significance of Christ's sacrificial death are ignored in Acts 2. So many scholars argue just leave the authorship of both Luke and Acts anonymous as it is in the manuscripts. They think that is at least in the oldest surviving manuscripts. They feel that's the best way to go. Dr. Holliday notes this might in some way, however, be explained in that in Acts, Paul's debates are with non-Christian Jews, while in Paul's letters, Paul is debating with Christian Jews, that is, Christians who have converted from Judaism and are members of the church. So Holliday teaches that scholars generally agree that Luke and Acts have a common author, but there is less agreement on who that author actually is and whether that author is reflecting Paul's theology. A strong point for common authorship is the reference in Acts to a previous letter to Theophilus, which the Gospel of Luke is addressed to, as is Acts, or mentioned in Acts. That seals it for most people, they say, that one point. The dating of Acts is also debated, with the exception of Acts, the fact that Acts was written after Luke. Some scholars take the position that Acts appears to be an attempt to help consolidate the faith of the various scattered congregations while some sort of crisis was going on. There is not much in Acts that can be used to date it. The latest datable event in Acts, notes Dr. Holliday, is the appointment of Festus as procurator of Judea. That date seems to be between 55 and 60 AD. Items after that date that did happen are not mentioned in it, such as the fire in Rome blamed on Christians by Nero, and that was 64 AD. Paul's death is not mentioned. So many historians suggest It was written before key events not listed and after the key events. I'm sorry, it was written before the key events that were listed and after the key events that happened that are not listed. But most scholars just won't go that early. The trend seems to be to place the writing to the last quarter of the first century, or even early second century AD, since it appears Acts depends on the history written by Josephus, which is believed penned somewhere in the 90s to early 100s. Holiday suggests dating it to somewhere in the 80s or 90s is about as plausible and defensible position as we might be able to get. Scholars today call this book that's Acts, Luke Acts, Volume 2. Acts manuscripts appears to have been untitled initially, according to several scholars. Instead, Dr. Holliday says it eventually acquired a title that describes its content in some ways. There is clear evidence that by mid to late 2nd century AD, it was known as Acts of the Apostles, or simply Acts. In about 200 AD, Irenaeus asked readers of Acts of the Apostles to derive a chronology that is compatible with the Pauline letters. Acts is the testimony of Luke regarding the apostles, he says. However, the origin of this title is not known, but few support it was assigned that the title that we know it as Acts of the Apostles, was not assigned by the author, but instead was adopted later than the writing. Scholars remark that the plural apostles may not be appropriate, as its main feature is Peter rather than the 12. And then in the second half, it's the self-appointed apostle, if you will, Paul, receives more attention than Peter. Only twice in Acts is Paul referred to as apostle, but not as a duly contributed apostle, notes Holliday. Some even argue that Luke likely did not consider Paul a full apostle, but he was doing an apostle's work. And that, in part, is what the story is about. And there are those that would argue that, in part, this book seems to have been written to expound on the work of Paul and to emphasize his apostleship. We will have another introductory lesson in our next session, but this hopefully will give you some idea of the opening foundation, anyway, that's behind this book of Luke Acts, Volume 2. Hope you have a good Bible study, and we'll hope to see you in the next session.